They talk about everything from confession to child care to non-topics. Yeah. And they have it all in a little book that I brought with me. I won't say how, you go, oh, this is really good.
So good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you, Ed. Thank you. So today is February 9th, a red letter day in history. It was on this date in 1555 that John Hooper, the Bishop of Gloucester, spelled Gloucester. If you're from the U.S., you look at it and say that's Gloucester, but if you're English, it's Gloucester, was burned at the stake for heresy. And this was during the reign of Mary, that is sister of Elizabeth. That would be Bloody Mary, not to be confused with Mary Queen of Scots, two different people. So you had, if you look at the English religious history in the 17th, 15th, 16th century, it starts out Catholic. Henry VIII, defender of the faith. Henry VIII leaves the Catholic Church, establishes the Anglican Church. His son Edward is a Protestant, king for 6 years. Then his daughter, Edward dies, and his daughter Mary takes over. Mary is his daughter of his first wife for 6 years. She becomes the queen and tries to bring Catholicism back. And this was part of the practice. She fails, she dies, and then Elizabeth I becomes queen of England, and then she's queen for the rest of the century. And then you have that third way, is what she talks about. But speaking of English religious history, it was on this date in 1709 that 5-year-old John Wesley is rescued from a house fire. This was something, he was asleep in the upper room, and his house caught on fire, and somebody put a ladder up and was able to pull him out of the fire shortly before the whole house kind of collapsed. And this was something that followed him his whole life, whereas he considered himself a brand as plucked from the fire. And of course, Wesley went on to found the Methodists. Actually, he was an Anglican his whole life, but then he was the founder of the Methodists because of their new methods. Let's see, that was 17. In 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant signed a law establishing within the U.S. Army Signal Service a division of telegrams and reports for the benefit of commerce. It's one of our favorite organizations. This is still around. Does anybody know what we call it today? Going once, going twice? Nope, the National Weather Service. That is now the National Weather Service. So, yeah, I don't know how. Hey, I just report the news here. Okay. So, on this date in 1895, William Morgan presented a new sport called mintonette. Mintonette at Springfield College of Massachusetts. Anybody know what we call that sport today? Close. Volleyball. Called volleyball. Yeah. And 1895.
That's kind of close to when basketball
Yes.
started too.
Actually, I think it's the same place. But be that as it may, in 1947, bank robber Willie Sutton escaped from a Philadelphia jail. So I now know two things about Willie Sutton. One of them is that he escaped from a Philadelphia jail in 1947, and he's famous for his quotation. He was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" And does anybody know his response? That's where the money is. That was Willie Sutton that said that. Well, speaking of Ed, I know where Ed was on this night in 1964. Do any of you know where you were in this night in 1964? That's right, sitting in front of the TV watching the Beatles' first appearance on Ed Sullivan. Right, Ed? Were you there? You were there. You won't admit it, will you? Maybe. I see. Okay. But and then along the same line, it was on this date in 1997 that The Simpsons, as in Homer et al., became the longest-running animated series with its 167th episode. As of today, they have 781. It's like that show is still going on. In fact, our younger son announced a while back that he was going to watch through The Simpsons. I'm like, well, good luck. We'll see you in 2028. kind of thing. Because yeah, 781 shows. That's a lot of TV. All right, well, welcome back. We're in 1 Samuel 25 again. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Abigail. I've enjoyed this, and we decided that if we would have had a third child and it was a girl, we would have named her Abigail. Actually, we didn't decide this. I just decided this. It's always news to Debbie. Really? Is that what we would have? You'd think we would sit down and have long discussions about what we would have named our third child, but we don't. I just stand up here and then we talk about it on the way home. No, we wouldn't have. Yes, we would have. No, that's not true. So today we're going to talk about, we're going to finish talking about Abigail, and we're going to talk about David's last confrontation with the king. The last time David and Saul meet up together face to face. So 1 Samuel 25, getting back to that story previously on 1 Samuel, we talked about David and his men have been wandering around the deserts in the south of Judah, in the course of which they ran into the flocks of Nabal and provided protection for them. Just kind of, and again, I look at it as he's just being kind or doing a normal neighborly thing for his clansmen. And then when he goes and asks for some help, he's kind of brutally said, "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse?" So David, after being rejected and insulted by Nabal, takes off with his men with the intent of killing every single male in that family. But he's met by Nabal's wife, Abigail, and this is the Stan analysis, who convinces him not to do anything stupid, like kill every single male. And it's kind of an interesting conversation, and we talked about this last week, that she just, her conversation, which, as we said last week, was the longest single speech of a woman in the Old Testament, that it's almost as if she's acting like it's a fortuitous circumstance that they just happen to meet. That, she doesn't say, "Don't kill Nabal," even though she knows her servant told her that disaster is hanging over our heads. She says, "Oh, it's so good that I met you. It's so good that you haven't done anything, unnecessary bloodshed." Okay, some of that stuff, and goes on and on. So then, let's see, where was I? When Abigail saw David, etc., etc. Verse 32, chapter 25, beginning with verse 32. This is where David begins his reply. And this is where we're actually getting to. David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me." Okay, so David's reply acknowledges several things. Number one, God sent her. Okay, God sent her. "And may you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." Okay, so again, remember, one of her things said, "Oh, it's a great thing because you only fight the Lord's battles." So David was bent on going and avenging himself. And Abigail's like, "Hey, well, it's a good thing you haven't done anything like that." And David's acknowledging, yeah, this is exactly what's happened. It says, "May you be blessed for your good judgment," etc. Otherwise, verse 34, "Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." It's interesting. I'm kind of wondering what the look on Abigail's face was at this point. I'm guessing she had that shock. Really? Wow. Again, we talked about she's intelligent and beautiful, and her husband was surly and mean, which again, this is how we described ourselves on our wedding invitation. Okay, I'll let you decide who is who, which was which, kind of stuff. But her gift was accepted. See, otherwise, then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." Now, her request was granted. Now, the question is, what request? What request did she actually make? Because she doesn't come in and say, don't kill Nabal. You know, the only request is that when the dust is settled over this whole thing, because remember, part of her speech was that, well, God is going to judge his enemies, of whom clearly Nabal is one. God is going to judge David's enemies, and he's going to wipe them out. And he says, when it's at that point, remember your servant. So Abigail is again, you can look at this a lot of different ways, and that's one of the interesting things about Abigail. Okay, you could look at it and say, hey, this is just somebody doing a good thing, and it just, what a coincidence, her husband died and David marries her. Or this could be a situation where she understood her place in the world, which in Old Testament society, if you were a widow, you were an outcast. Now, there's no indication that Abigail has any children at this point. And there's a view that says Abigail as the widow of Nabal. One way to look at this is as Abigail is the widow of Nabal, and so David marries her and gets a control of all of Nabal's land, which is possible. That's a possibility. It's also possible that Nabal, being a rich, surly, mean guy, had more than one wife, because David did, and that Abigail, not having any children, would have been left high and dry at his death, at Nabal's death. Okay, and she recognizes this, and so she's very wisely figuring out, okay, here's what I've got to do. This is my best bet at this point. That if he'll marry me, then I'll be out of the woods. I won't be left in the cold, which is exactly what would have happened to her had she not. If Nabal dies and she's a widow, she's got nothing. Because again, if you didn't have a child, if you didn't have a child and you were a widow or a son, you were an outcast. Okay, the best you could do is go back to your family if they'd have you. And this is kind of what happened with Naomi, in the book of in the book of Ruth. It's happening during the time of Judges. Okay, her husband dies. She doesn't have a son. Her sons die, so she's left without a son, and so she goes back to her family, and she tells Ruth and Orpah, "Go, I've got nothing for you there," kind of thing. So her request was granted. And again, to summarize the story, and I said this last week, to summarize the story, a woman was commissioned and sent by God to deliver a message to a man that was necessary and effective. Okay, so this is important. Like if your theology and view of the world involves, very silent, submissive women, Abigail is a problem. Okay, because she's anything but. Remember, she doesn't tell Nabal what she's doing. She just takes it upon herself, and she goes and she doesn't tell Nabal what she's taking Nabal's stuff, right? Because again, she's the wife. This is a very patriarchal society. Okay, so she only has possessions because she's married to Nabal. So she takes these things and gives them away to Nabal's enemy, and says, "Here, Now it's a good thing what she's doing." But it's like I said, if you're, oh yeah, this is, let's let the women all keep silent. So as a result, Debbie has the authority to give away any of my stuff to people who are on the way to kill me. That's one of the lessons that we've learned from this. No, I'm just kidding. To me, it's fascinating. And this is one of the things, and then this is really all we see of Abigail. This is her story. This is, she's here. She's got this whole event. And then, other than being referenced as one of David's wives and her child, she disappears from the story. Okay, and I think it goes with the bigger picture in Samuel, that Samuel is a story of there are several examples of events here in Samuel where a woman comes in and saves the day. Okay, and I think I mentioned this last week. So I mean, it's a great I'm trying to convince Debbie to write a book called The Women of Samuel, kind of thing. We're working on it. I told her we could agree to have named our third child anything, but no, just kidding. But you had, again, the priesthood is in disarray, and Hannah shows up and fixes it. David is about to destroy things here and ruin his reputation, and Abigail shows up. Okay, Saul is out to kill him, and Michael shows up. Okay, I say now, what are we going to do with Bathsheba? Well, we'll talk about Bathsheba when we get there, kind of thing. So that's coming up, not soon. So, any questions on Abigail? Well, I'm not done with her yet. I'll ask her questions on Abigail. So, to go home in peace, I have heard your words and granted your request. Verse 36. When Abigail went to Nabal, so now she's successfully placated David. David is gone. She goes back. Now she's going to tell Nabal what she did, except she can't. When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. Because you remember, this was sheep shearing time. So this was like the harvest. This was like when all the money was flowing. If you're going to have a party, this is the time to do it. So he's in the middle of a party, okay, like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, okay? And Abigail realizes this is not a good time to tell him what I did. So she doesn't. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. Okay? It says Abigail returns home, but Nabal is partying and too drunk to talk. The next morning, Abigail tells Nabal, and he has a stroke, probably. Okay? Again, we don't really know. It's just people looking at it have said it's probably a stroke is what happened to the guy, which suggests that Nabal is much older. Okay, and again, this would be consistent that Nabal is older and Abigail is younger. That she knows he's not in good health, which is one of the reasons why she's pretty certain that he's not going to last when she's talking to David. Okay, she kind of sees the writing on the wall. I don't have a kid. He's old. He's going to die. He's making enemies left and right. But what's interesting is it says, and then about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. Okay. David, the next morning, Abigail tells him he has a stroke, probably. But what's interesting here is that the writer makes it clear that it's the Lord that takes care of Nabal after 10 days. So maybe it's at 10 days for him to think about what it means to have spent your whole life being surly and mean. I don't know. But after 10 days, Nabal is killed, dies. The Lord struck Nabal. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt." So David praises the Lord when he hears of Nabal's death. Now this passage here, this verse here is what makes me think that when David is just making a reasonable request. And again, one view of this is that David is shaking down Nabal. Kind of the, hey, it's terrible if an accident would happen or something like that. But when in fact it's just a reasonable, I'm taking care of my clansmen, you take care of me, we kind of help each other out. Okay. And it also, again, David takes it as vindication that, yeah, David, I was treated with contempt. Okay. Which, contempt is an interesting subject. Has anybody read anything by John Gottman? Who know who John Gottman is? He runs, I forget what he calls it. He's like a marriage counselor guy, sociologist, marriage counselor, therapist, kind of thing. And he's written several books. One of them is called "Why Marriages Succeed or Fail," and the other one is called 7 Principles of Marriage or something like that. He's not a believer. But what he does is, part of his research is that he's got this location where he brings people in, married couples in, and starts a conversation, has them start talk about what you would have named your third child, and then kind of goes back and forth and watches them, videotapes them watching. And he says, and I guess he's been able to prove this, that with like upper 90%, 90 plus accuracy can tell whether a marriage is going to succeed or fail based on viewing their discussion of some topic. And the key element that he talks about, the key killer of a marriage is contempt. That when you treat someone with contempt, and the number one indicator, does anybody know what the number one indicator that a person is treating somebody else with contempt is? It's something visual. Eye rolling. Eye rolling. Just remember that today. I said, go home. Do not roll your eyes at your spouse. I'm just telling you, or your grandparents. Okay. It's just eye rolling, treating them with contempt. And this is a secular writer that just says, he's also the one that says one of the ways you can tell how successful or how strong a marriage is to ask the couple individually how they met their spouse. Okay. And that if that's a pleasant story to tell, if they obviously relish telling that story, then there's hope for the marriage. But if that story causes pain, then it's kind of that's got nothing to do with. Although Abigail and David I don't know how they relayed their story. Let me tell you how we met. How did we meet? Oh, it's such a cute story. David was going to come kill my husband. And I was there, and it was just kind of thing. But I'm sure there's a way that they could make it interesting. Well, that's a fun story. Yeah. Well, you could get Debbie's version, or you could get the true version, which is mine.
One is more entertaining than the other.
Yeah. That takes we met at Camp Joy. Anybody in Joy Baptist Camp? And we traveled about 105 miles north, and discovered that we lived a mile apart from each other. So I traveled 105 miles, and she traveled 106. And it was a long discussion where she was very resistant to talking to anyone like me. Okay, but eventually I wore her down, broke her down, kind of thing. But it's again, there's the true. One of us is telling the true story, and the other one shades it a bit. So be that as it may. So David praises the Lord when he hears of Nabal's death. David then, okay, where am I here? About 10 days later, the Lord. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife." She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, "I am your servant, and am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Abel quickly got on a donkey, and attended by her 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. Okay, so David then sends word to Abigail. So there's 2 things that are happening here, and there may be a piece missing. Okay, because 2 things happen. David says it sends word to Abigail to become his wife, which you could argue was kind of her subtle "remember your servant" thing. Okay, David sends word, and then you hear about David sending his servants to say, "We're here to take you to be my wife." David sent us to take you to be his wife. Okay, now there does Abigail respond? Like, is it David sent word, and then in the middle there, David sends it back, or is David sending word the sending of the servants? You see the point I'm making? See, because what's happening here is you see David is, taking advantage of this situation to, hey, I'm going to get me another wife. Okay, Abigail needs to be married. David doesn't. Okay, Abigail needs to be married because that's how that society was. David doesn't. Okay, so I'm like, gee, is this ever going to happen again? Where David is just going to see someone and say, I like that. I think I'll take it. Foreshadowing, I don't know. It just kind of tells you, and part of it is when, again, one of the books I've read on Samuel talks about Samuel as being a picture of power and what power does. And David is somebody who is accumulating power and influence. Okay. Now, Abigail is willing. Abigail, there's no question about it. What does it say? Abigail quickly got on a donkey. Okay. Abigail's response suggests she was expecting or hoping. I don't know why the H is capitalized there. It just was expecting or hoping for this. I think she certainly was hoping for it. Whether she was expecting, I don't know, kind of this. And by the way, it's like, and then the writer says, and by the way, David had also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. So wait a minute. David already has another wife. In fact, David has two wives, except Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel, son of Laish, who was from Galim. So, and by the way, David already has a second wife, Ahinoam, who's going to give birth to Amnon. He's going to come back later. Remember that. Remember that name. Amnon's going to become important later on.
How can a father who's already given away his daughter to be a wife take her back?
That's an excellent question. The question there is how can a father give away, take her back? Okay, so if you go to the next line, that should be 3 wives total, except Saul gave Michal to a guy named Paltiel. Why? Okay, why would Saul do that? Well, Saul's the king. He is the king. David is going to be the king, but Saul is the king. Okay, why would Saul do that? Yes?
Well, it's to kind of show David who's really in charge.
Yes, look at that first thing, a power move on the part of Saul. Okay, now again, we know that Saul knows that David is going to be the king. At least he says so, right? He says David is going to be the king. I know you're going to be the king. Okay, and if David and Michal had a child, had a son, that Michal was his first wife, had they had a son right away, that would have been the next king. That would have joined the two families together. Everybody would be happy-ish, kind of thing. Again, if you follow, we talked about Henry VIII a little bit earlier. Having a son was a huge thing. Henry VIII went through 6 wives trying to find a son, to come up with a son. He ended up with 6 wives, 2 daughters, and a son. Okay, and the 2 daughters both died young. Okay, but having, in the whole royalty thing, having succession, having a king was a huge, having a son was a huge thing. Okay, and that would have been, David's, it would have been Saul's grandson, this child. That didn't occur, but that would have been Saul's grandson, but it would have been David's son, and then there would have been, okay, he has to be the king because his son is going to be the king and all that kind of stuff. And so, Saul, again, despite what he's saying, is doing all of this stuff. Saul said after chapter 24 that, okay, so David, you're good. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done this. And then next thing you know, as we're going to find out, Saul is still chasing David, kind of thing. And so Saul clearly, despite what he says, is doing everything he can to keep David out of power. Okay, because that's kind of how power works. People don't just give it up. Okay, you can transfer that to whatever you think about the state of American, the politics today is that, once people get power, they just don't give it up. That was one of the things about George Washington that made him such an amazing person, is that he walked away. He walked away from being because after the Revolution, and George Washington was the victorious general of the army, there was a movement to make George Washington the king of America. Okay, and Washington said, no, not going to do it. Walked away, went home to Mount Vernon. Okay, so he could have been the king of America. Okay, but he chose not to. Okay, and then it wasn't until a couple of centuries later that we had the King of America, Elvis, right? But then he becomes the president, right? He's the first president. He's the president. He serves a term, then he serves a second term, and then what does he do? He walks away. No, that's it. That's enough. I don't need to do this anymore. Okay, and he set a precedent that lasted until the 1940s. Okay, and then was outlawed. We'll see. We'll see whether it continues at this point. But he walked away from power. But he's unusual. That's unusual. He's the exception and not the rule. Okay. So Saul is doing everything he can to keep David out of power. In this story. Where was I? That should be 3 wives total. Except Saul gave Michal to a guy named Paltiel. Why? Well, it's a power move on the part of Saul, and it's a move that isn't going to end well. Okay, so at this point, I admire Abigail, and I feel very sorry for Michal. Again, if you remember Michal, how did Michal feel about David? She loved David. It says so twice. The only time in the Bible where it said that a woman loves a man. Twice, Michal loved David. Okay, doesn't say anything about Abigail loving David or Ahinoam loving David or any of David's other 8 wives. He had a total of 8. Okay, so I'm sorry.
Question.
Yes.
This is something I've been wondering for a while. Maybe why doesn't Michal go with David? If that's the case.
I don't know. That's a good question. The question is, why didn't Michal go with David? Well, she's I forget the chapter, but she's there to, I think she creates the plan for David to escape. And I think to gain time, she has to stay there, because the soldiers come and say, we need to see David. And he says, oh, he's ill. And nobody's going to break into the room. Nobody's going to break into the room because it's the king's daughter, and we're not going to. So the guys go back to Saul and say he's ill, and Saul says, bring him to me. And so that's when they break into the room, and then you find out the idol and all of that's kind of on the bed. And so she has to stay there to cover for David. Why doesn't she go on? I don't know. That's a good question. David doesn't call for her. I don't know. Again, it never says that David loved Michal. In fact, again, when I say it's not going to end well, you'll see what I'm talking about, because later on you do have a conversation between Michal and David, and it's not pretty. Kind of at the end, but we'll get to that later. Any other questions on it? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. By the way, you guys, side note, rabbit trail, we're going to be gone in March. We're going, again, remember we talked about this last week. If we get kidnapped by Turkish Muslims, you guys are going to raise money for us. But during, I don't want you to negotiate with a terrorist. I want you to just pay them. The only question should be how much, and oh, sure. But during that time, Enrique will be teaching, so please come out. He's going to be talking about the Pharisees. I think it's titled something, You Too Can Be a Pharisee, something like that. I don't know, something like that. Any other questions on Abigail? Because we're gonna change subjects here real quick. All right, so in chapter 26, we have the return of the Ziphites. If you remember the Ziphites, they were in a part of chapter 24. They came to Saul and they said, hey, we know where David is. Okay, and then and we talked about the Ziphites being, they're part of the tribe of Judah. They're there. There's a town of Ziph. There's people that live in the area, Ziphites. They're willing to go to Saul and say, hey, we know where David is. Saul says, well, go get some information and we'll think about it. Then the events of chapter 24 happen. This is where Saul goes in the cave and cuts a corner off his robe. Then we have the story of Abigail. Then now the Ziphites have come back. Okay, so Saul in chapter 26, the Ziphites return, Ziphites, again trying to surrender David to Saul. The Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeon and said, "Is not David hiding in the hill of Hakilah, which faces Jeshimon?" Say, "Yea, we still know where he is." So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 select Israelite troops to search for David. Okay. Saul goes looking, but David finds him first. Saul made his camp beside the road on the hill of Hakilah, facing Jeshimon, but David stayed in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, he sent out scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. Okay. Now, this is a similar story to 24. Okay, so this is a story where David is going to take the spear and the water jug. Remember, he gets right up next to Saul. Whereas in 24, Saul is relieving himself in a cave and he cuts a corner of his robe. Okay, now there is an argument out there that this is the same story. Okay, just like there's an argument in kind of contemporary scholarship that like the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 are the same story, told two different ways. I don't believe that. I don't think the author believed that. I think that, given the details, there's a lot of similarities. There certainly are. But I think, the differences, make it clear to me that this is two different events. But I'm just throwing it out there that there are some that say that this is the same event and that the author just kind of took two different versions of the same story and put them in. Okay. But I think the differences kind of make it clear that it's not. For one thing, here, David is much more in control this time. David knows where Saul is. Saul doesn't know where David is. Okay? Whereas the last time, David just happened to be in the right place at the wrong time, the wrong place at the right time, right place at the right, I don't know. Okay? It was a complete accident that he ran over. Now David knows where Saul is. Okay? Then David set out. Now, this is something that is taking place at night, but it doesn't say. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner, son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Saul was lying inside the camp with the army encamped around him. Okay. So Saul goes looking for David, but David finds him first. That's the next one. Saul is with Abner, okay, who is his nephew. Okay. So Ner is Saul's uncle. If you remember way back in chapter 8, I think it was, there's an uncle who says to Saul, "What did Samuel tell you?" He's not named, but many people believe that's Ner, same guy, N-E-R. If we were going to have a fourth son, we would have named him Ner, just because more things to talk about on the way home. Wait a minute. How many sons were we going to have? I don't know, 17, 18? But so David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, "Who will go down into the camp with me to Saul?" "I'll go with you," said Abishai. So David is with Abishai, okay, who is David's nephew, because Zeruiah is David's sister. Okay, now this is just for information. Zeruiah, David's sister, has three sons. Well, three sons that are involved in the story. You have Abishai, who we're talking about right now, Joab, who is going to become the commander of David's army, and Asahel, A-S-A-H-E-L. Okay, he's going to come up later, but I'm just telling you now. Zeruiah, David's sister, has three sons that are fighting with David. Okay, so all of Joab and Asahel actually come together. I'm sorry, Abner and Asahel come together much later. Okay. "So I'll go with you," said Abishai. So David and Abishai, these two guys, uncle and nephew, went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Now, where have we seen, heard, or found ourselves near Saul's spear before? What has Saul done with this spear? Yeah, he threw it at David twice, missed both times, and then the third time he tried to run David through with it. So David knows this spear, okay? Hey, I've seen that spear, kind of thing. So you have this situation where David and Asahel are able to just walk into the camp, okay? Now, don't get too impressed with David and Asahel's ability to sneak through the camp. I mean, it's impressive. Takes a lot of guts, okay? But they had help, okay? Okay? So, and we'll get to that in a second. But today, Abishai says to David in verse 8, today God has delivered your enemy into your hands, okay? Again, Abishai is saying almost exactly what David's men said to him in the cave. Hey, David, seriously, come on. This is your enemy. He's right there. This is your chance. Okay? And then Abishai says, let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I won't strike him twice. Okay? Again, he's telling David, listen, I am going to do to Saul what Saul was unable to do to you. I'm going to pick up the spear and I'm going to just, right there, I'm going to take care of it. Okay? Now David said to Abishai, don't destroy him. And here, this is like a key principle of David's life. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed? And this is a principle that David lives by. Okay, and there are a couple of people to their detriment are going to discover how important this is to David. Okay, there are at least three people are going to find out later on in the text how important that is to David. Okay, and of course, David has, to be fair, David has a vested interest because David is also the Lord's anointed. Okay, and if he sets the precedent that, hey, it's okay to kill off the Lord's anointed, that's kind of like, well, I'm the Lord's anointed too. Okay, but as surely as the Lord lives, David says, listen, you don't need to kill him because one of three things is going to happen. Okay, one of three things is going to happen. Oh, that's right, we are turning over, page 2. David and others find Saul and others, et al., asleep with his spear and water jug. Abishai, repeating the words of 24:4, offers to kill David. David refuses the offer, preferring to let one of three things happen to Saul. The Lord himself will strike him, which is what happened in Nabal, the last enemy David had to deal with. Okay, the Lord will strike him. His time will come and he will die. He'll die of old age. Or he'll go into battle and perish. One of those three things are going to happen. And it's interesting that even in that list, David is to me saying, listen, I will wait until David dies of old age, or until Saul dies of old age. Now, we don't know how old Saul is at this point. He's probably in his 50s or 60s, somewhere in that time period, maybe older. I mean, he turned out to rule for 40 years. So depending on how old he was when he started, he's probably in his 50s or 60s. And, life expectancy wasn't, I don't know. I really have no idea what the life expectancy was. But still, it's like, I'll wait till he dies of old age. Okay, I am not that anxious to get it. Okay, and again, this is kind of an interesting view of power here. If you've ever seen the Scottish play, Shakespeare's Scottish play, I would say the name, but I don't want lightning to strike me or anything like that. There's the main character's name is Macbeth. See, I can tell you who the characters are, right? Okay, but he's given a prophecy that you're going to be king someday. Basically, this is the stand version of this play. And so once he gets this prophecy, he and his wife, he and Lady Macbeth, set about, let's kind of move these things along. Whereas David is like, you know what? And it doesn't end well for the king or queen. That's the play where you've got, is this a dagger I see before me? Out, damn spot. Who would have thought that old man had so much blood in him? Kind of, those are all kind of great lines from that particular play. But you can't say the name of the play, especially in the theater. You can't say the name of the play in the theater. Otherwise, you have to, there's this whole routine you have to do, which involves apologizing and throwing salt over your shoulder and spinning around 3 times and walking off the stage. So I'm not making this up. We've seen it done, right? A director came out before the play started and apologized to the audience that in some previous conversation somewhere or on stage or something, she had said the name of the play. And so she gets up there in front of the audience and spins around 3 times, throws salt over his shoulder. Did she do anything else? You remember? But we're like, seriously? You know, yeah. People in the theater, they're a weird bunch. I'm kidding. Don't tell Ian I said that. Now you can go ahead and tell him. Yeah. Yeah. Why do such normal parents have weird kids? That's what
Well, thanks for calling us normal.
I was thinking of our kid. No, I'm just kidding. No. So, be that as it may, David is willing to, I'll wait till he dies of old age. Okay. Now, but the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now, get the spear and water jug that are near his head and let's go. So David is talking to Abishai. He says, he's going to die. He's going to die in battle. The Lord's going to strike him. Just grab the spear and water jug and let's go. And then it says in verse 12, so David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head. So either David grabs it or Abishai grabs it and gives it to David or whatever. But they walk out of there with the water jug and the spear. So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. Okay, so again, I'm not saying David was walking in there like a bull in a china shop. He was probably being super sneaky. But, there's 3,000 guys asleep there. And the odds that you can walk past a guard into the inner sanctum right next to the king without somebody noticing you, as sneaky as you might be, it's kind of hard to believe, okay? Unless you've got help. So I don't know, maybe the Lord's watching this story and he's seeing what's happening. And he's up there and he's talking to the angels. Is he going to walk in there? Yeah, he is. I don't know. What's his, okay, let's just put everybody into a deep sleep. See where there's, I don't know. Okay. So he goes in, he grabs the sword. Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of a hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them. He called out to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, aren't you going to answer me, Abner? So he gets far enough away from them so that he's like out of arrow range or spear range or whatever. And he calls out to Abner. Okay, so now Abner, let's see now. Abner would be Michael's cousin, right? So maybe Abner was at the wedding. Maybe that's how he knows him. I don't know. Maybe he got a nice fruit basket or, a plate from them for a wedding present or something. But he doesn't mention Saul. Okay, he mentions Abner. Okay, he calls out to Abner, and he says, Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" David is ignoring that. He just says, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king?" So David, he puts some distance between him and Saul's army. Then he calls out to Abner. He accuses Abner of dereliction of duty. Dereliction, dereliction, something like that, of duty. Other words, also known as being bad at your job. Okay. Someone came to destroy your lord. Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king. What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men must die because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. David says Abner and his men must die for failing to protect the king. It's like, Abner, you had one job. One job. Keep an eye on your king. Okay? Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head? Okay? So like, oh, okay, yeah, well. Yeah, I remember it was there, oops, kind of thing. Saul recognized David's voice. So at this point, Saul is awake. Saul recognizes, I'm sorry, I didn't put a lot of space there for the word recognized. I don't, sometimes I judge it right, not always. Saul recognizes David and says, again, this is the exact same thing he says in 24. Is that your voice, David, my son? David replied, yes, it is, my lord the king. And he added, why is my lord pursuing his servant? Okay, David says, yes, my lord the king. Also, why are you, and I put in parentheses, the word there is still, pursuing me? Why are you still pursuing me? What have I done and what wrong am I guilty of? Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's word. If the Lord has incited you against me, if I have done something to offend you, let me know, and I'll make an offering for it. What wrong have I done? Can I make an offering for any sin that I may have committed? Okay. Then may he accept an offering. If, however, people have done it, if somebody has put you up to this, remember in 24, he says, why do you listen to the people who are sending you out to me? He says, they have driven me to, if however people have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have driven me today from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, go serve other gods. Okay, they're trying to put me somewhere that I'm not supposed to be. Okay, and so he curses them. Go serve other gods. Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountain. I'm just like a flea, which is one of the things he said about himself in chapter 24. I'm just a flea. I'm nothing. Trying to explain to Saul, I am not a threat to you. He is a threat to Saul's family, but he's not a threat to Saul. Okay, and Saul already took care of that. Saul got a promise from him that he wasn't going to kill David's family, that David wasn't going to kill Saul's family. Okay. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Saul confesses his sin. I have sinned. Okay. Compare this, we're going to hear that phrase again in Samuel, specifically Samuel 12:13, where David is going to say it. It says, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong. Okay. The last time that somebody, was referred to as a fool around David, the guy ended up with a stroke and then dead after 10 days. But I've been acting like a fool. I've been wrong. He promises not to harm David and that he, Saul, has been a fool. What's interesting here is David is still over on that hill over there, and he says, here's the king's spear, David answered. Let one of you young men come over and get it. David may be crazy, but he's not stupid. They're all awake now. He's not going to walk back into the camp with the spear. He says, let one of you send someone over here to get your spear. Okay, send someone over here to get it. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. Okay? And right now, all the trouble that's being caused in David's life is because of Saul. David won't bring the islands back to Saul. David trusts that the Lord will value his life like David values Saul's life. Then in verse 25, we have Saul's final words to David. Okay, this is the last time David and Saul have a conversation. May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph. May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph. So David went on his way and Saul returned home, which is exactly what happened last time. David's like, yeah, I'm not. In fact, moving into chapter 27, David thought, verse 1 says, but David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. He just knows Saul is not going to give up. Okay. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. Although we'll pick up there next week. Just want to point out, moving into chapter 27, David doesn't believe that Saul will stop chasing him, so he escapes to the land of the Philistines, which is about the last place you'd think David would go. Okay? And the irony is that this is, he goes there, and he lives there for a while, and we'll have a couple of adventures while he's in with the Philistines and with King Achish, who we've met before he ends up getting what the Lord had promised him. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again next week.